So in this section, we're going to continue looking at the Nixon years, and our learning objective here is quite simple. We're going to describe Nixon's downfall. And we also will describe the constitutional crisis that arose from the Watergate scandal. So, first of all, we need to look at Nixon and his personality, which ultimately plays a huge role in his downfall. Nixon had become resentful of his critics during his political career. And he even had an enemies list of politicians and other members of the media that ultimately he felt had wronged him. At one point in time, he felt like he was dead in the water. And the reality is, here's a guy who became vice president in 1952 when he ran, as a part of the Eisenhower administration, or part of that ticket. And even dating back to that point in time, he was accused of being dishonest. He had to go before the nation in his checkers speech to defend his position. And so, Nixon had this long history. He serves 8 years as the Vice President of the United States under Eisenhower. And then in 1960, he runs for the presidency against John F. Kennedy and loses. Now, normally, when you head a major party ticket and you lose, that's usually it for your political career, at least in terms of running for the White House. Rarely do candidates reemerge and run again. But Nixon was the exception. Nixon does come back in 1968 and runs, and of course successfully wins the White House. But he also had grown very resentful of people that he felt had stood in his way or prevented him from doing well. So during the 1972 re-election campaign, this is what really becomes sad, is that Nixon easily won the 1972 election, but Nixon and his supporters really looked to gain any advantage that they could, which really proved to be unnecessary, but still, they're looking for whatever advantage they can find. And this brings us to the Watergate break-in. So on the night of June 17th, 1972, so, we're talking really just, a few months, probably about 5 months out, from a little less than 5 months out from the 1972 election, Frank Willis, a security guard at the Watergate building in Washington, D.C., which was kind of a combination apartment/office building, he notices something kind of strange. He notices tape on the locks of the doors, which he thinks is a little bit strange. So he removes the tape, and then he comes back later and finds that the doors are taped again. Well, that makes him very suspicious, so he calls the police. 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters, which had their office in this Watergate building. They went there, of course, to try to gain campaign information and to place wiretaps so they could learn a little bit more about the Democrats' strategy in the election. So one of the burglars arrested was James McCord, an ex-CIA official and a member of the committee for the re-election of the president. As soon as questions about the break-in started, the cover-up started. Many did not believe that Nixon ordered the break-in, but it does appear that he did order the cover-up. So, as the 1972 election plays out over the next few months, many people believe Nixon when he said he had nothing to do with the break-in, and he wins the 1972 election by a landslide, defeating George McGovern and taking more than 60% of the popular vote. So things look pretty good for him. But there are numerous problems in his administration. One, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, has his own scandal and is forced to resign. So within the first year of Nixon's second term, Agnew is forced to resign. On October 10th, 1973, Agnew resigned facing allegations of accepting bribes. So Nixon picked Gerald Ford to replace Agnew as the new vice president. Also in 1973, the Watergate burglars went on trial, and their testimony opened the floodgates of accusations. John Dean, counsel to the president, testified that Nixon was active in the cover-up and break-in. It was revealed that Nixon had a taping system installed to record his conversations to help him with writing his memoirs. Now, this is something that many presidents do. When they leave the White House, they oftentimes, write their memoirs, and then those are sold. And there are many people that like to read about the presidents, read what the presidents were thinking at different times. And so Nixon's just trying to help himself with this process when he has the taping system put in. But ultimately it becomes a liability, because once people find out that there is this taping system, everybody wants to get their hands on the tapes. Every group that was investigating the Watergate break-in request access to these tapes. Nixon refused to turn over the tapes, citing executive privilege, which is, once again, the concept that the president's communications are protected as a matter of national security. Now, critics would say that the only time we ever see executive privilege really invoked is when they have done something wrong. And that does pretty much hold to be true. The justification for executive privilege is that, the president deals with highly classified stuff. The president does have to make decisions that are a matter of national security, and if the president has to release this information to the general public, it could jeopardize our national security. There is a legitimate concern there. So Nixon finally, feeling a lot of pressure to turn over these tapes, Nixon eventually turns over edited transcripts. These edited transcripts are turned over, hoping that that's going to kind of appease the courts and the investigators, and that they'll kind of drop it. The independent special prosecutor that was appointed to investigate Watergate, Archibald Cox, went to court to request that the tapes be turned over. He's not satisfied with the edited transcripts, and of course he's wondering, well, what was edited out? So this leads to an incident that becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre. And ultimately Nixon really doesn't help himself here, but since Cox refused to drop his subpoena for the tapes, Nixon requested that Attorney General Elliot Richardson fire Cox. And Richardson refused and resigned in protest. So now you've got, really an Attorney General here who's fairly prominent, who resigns, and then, ultimately this doesn't appease anybody. And ultimately, because he refused to fire Archibald Cox, then Nixon's got to find somebody else to try to fire Cox. So he ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox, but he also resigned. So now you've got two resignations, two fairly high-profile resignations, and then finally the Solicitor General Robert Bork complied and fired Cox. So in the end, you've got Cox is fired. This was a special prosecutor investigating, and then you've also got two other high-ranking officials that have resigned in protest. The whole thing looks really bad for Nixon. And then we get to the so-called proverbial smoking gun. In July, the Supreme Court ruled that the unedited tapes must be handed over, and Nixon complied. The tapes revealed that Nixon had approved a cover-up. Now, once again, that doesn't necessarily mean that he ordered a cover-up, but ultimately, on the tapes, he's kind of heard giving his consent to the idea of covering up what has taken place. So this really becomes Nixon's downfall. And like I said, that whole constitutional crisis is whether the president's communications should be protected. And there is a sense in which, yes, there's a legitimate need, but that also can be abused. And so, that's what the court really has to deal with. Should the president's communications be protected by executive privilege? All of this ends up leading to Nixon's resignation. Facing impeachment in the House of Representatives and a likely conviction in the Senate, Nixon resigned. Now, Nixon's resignation um, may not have come had he thought that he could survive impeachment. We've only had 2 presidents that have actually been impeached. The process of impeachment, a lot of people may think impeachment means removed, and that's not necessarily so. To be impeached, all it takes is for the House to pass impeachment charges. But it goes to the Senate for a trial, and the Senate can acquit or the Senate can convict. The Senate has some different options as far as what they can do. One of the things that they can do if they convict is remove the president from office. And I think most people believe that Nixon likely would have been convicted had it gone to the Senate, and it probably was going to pass the House. Nixon kind of was aware of what his potential fate was and went ahead and resigned. Now, the other presidents that have been impeached, we have to go all the way back to the Civil War for the first, and that was, or actually, I shouldn't say to the Civil War, but almost. We have to go back into the Reconstruction period. Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, then became president after Lincoln was assassinated. He was impeached. Largely, that was political. He survived conviction by a single vote, but largely it came down to the fact that a lot of radical Republicans during Reconstruction felt that he was too soft in the South because he was a Southerner, and they kind of set him up for that. The other impeachment happened actually after the Nixon resignation, and that happened in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president, and he had just been reelected to a second term when news broke that he had allegedly had an affair with a 21-year-old Washington intern named Monica Lewinsky. We'll talk more about that later, but in the case of in the case of Clinton, Clinton was impeached, but it went to the Senate where he too was acquitted. So we've never actually removed a president through the impeachment process. But Nixon, however, would have likely been removed, but instead he resigned, and he still remains the only president to have ever resigned from office.